guys, welcome back to Current Crisis. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the Russia-Ukraine war and what does this mean for you as Gen Z. But before we begin, please comment, subscribe, and like this video. Let's get into the video. So I'm coming from a nonpartisan perspective and coming from what is best for human life. Like I said, what does this mean for you as a teen? Is this important to know? Facts to know? Everything is going to be in this video, so you're going to want to watch to the very end for all of that. Let's give historical context to what has been going on with Russia and Ukraine. The war started in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and fueled conflict in eastern Ukraine. The full-scale invasion began in 2022. The 2025 blast zone, so fighting still remains concentrated in eastern Ukraine and different parts and bits of the southern territory. And this is what you're kind of seeing is I guess the big question is, why is Russia and Ukraine fighting? Basically, some of it is over land. They're fighting over land. Ukraine wants to keep the land and Russia wants to kind of take the land, but that's like very, very summed up and not giving nuance to the different perspectives here. Unfortunately, though, with the war hardships and human cost, the high casualties is that Russia has reached 1 million casualties this summer, as well as Ukraine has lost a ton of troops and a lot of casualties. I'm not really seeing the numbers here right now, but equipment losses on both sides have been thousands of tanks, fighting vehicles, artillery units, and aircrafts have been destroyed. Civilians suffer. Ongoing strikes continue to damage infrastructure and lives, and this is on both sides. But yeah, Russia has caused a lot of conflict, but we're going to try to see the nuance here. And like I said, nonpartisan. So, what Trump is trying to do, right? So we see Russia and Ukraine fighting and it is taking a toll. And so we have Donald Trump from America. He's our American president, trying to sit down with both of these leaders, discuss what is going to be advantageous for the both of them and how to stop this war. Why is this important? Because if one war starts in a particular country, then there's opportunities that more countries will take the sides of certain countries, right? We saw this with World War II. We saw this with World War I. The second two kind of countries start having conflict, start fighting, there becomes a war, then there is a potential to go into World War III, and Donald Trump is trying to stop that potential before it even begins. Well, it has begun, but he's trying to stop it as quickly as he can. Trump has ruled out boots on the ground in Ukraine. Instead, the U.S. has offered air support if a peace agreement backs it. Security guarantees, but no NATO. That is one of the reasons I believe why Russia kind of started to invade Ukraine as well, was because Ukraine kind of wanted to join NATO. Russia did not want that. There had been a previous agreement that Ukraine would not join NATO, so it is just an insistent agreement that Ukraine cannot join NATO. It is part of this peace treaty that they're trying to agree on. Land for peace talk, that means accepting Russian control over parts of Donbas or even Crimea. Trump is pitching himself as the peacemaker, aiming to bring Zelensky and Putin to direct negotiation or to be able to stop this. So yeah, that is basically kind of very, very summed up. We're going to go even into more detail, but they're fighting over a lot of land, NATO conflicts, right? Things that maybe us as teens don't understand. But basically the big thing is that Ukraine kind of separated from Russia. Russia was obviously this big, big land, and then Ukraine was kind of bordering on Russia, and then I believe they kind of separated themselves. Putin is trying to kind of regain control over that and kind of wanting to instill it as Russia again, because I believe he said in the interview with Tucker and all of this stuff that he kind of wants Russia to be united once again. And like I said, I'm not for Putin. I'm not for Zelensky or anything like that. I'm truly trying to just figure out the facts and do good journalism for us as teens, because what the heck does this mean for us? I'm trying to piece together, number one, what is already going on, but number two, how this would affect Gen Z. Why is it important for Gen Z to know this stuff? And I think it's important for us to know what is going on because we are so young, and it's important to educate ourselves on what is going on currently. Because if this war gets any worse, it could possibly drag us into the next World War. And I know I'm being a little dramatic right now. We're nowhere near there right now, but we very closely could get there, just as we saw with the Israel and Palestine and all of that stuff is very closely it got to potentially turning into World War III. So when you're dealing with these countries that are fighting, it's very, very difficult and a slow process and trying to figure out what is going to be advantageous to both countries. So that is why this is important for us as teens to know our history and to know our facts, so that we also can't be swayed either way. There is push for Ukraine, there is push for Russia, but in reality, both countries have done things that I don't completely agree with. I don't like really either president, and so for myself, I'm sticking to nonpartisan and what is going to be actually advantageous for the civilians of Russia and Ukraine, because no civilian, no child, no woman, no man should ever have to go through a war, but unfortunately here we are, so how do we deal with this? And on Trump's side, what was kind of interesting was, I believe in an interview, he said that ending the war might help him get to heaven. He said, I want to try and get to heaven. He's talking about his spirituality. He dialed into Fox and Friends on Tuesday morning and revealed his newest and truest motivation for brokering an end to the war in Russia. He's worried that he might not get to heaven after he dies. And I think this is really interesting as a Christian. I 100% agree, or not agree, but I 100% see the hand of God over Trump's life, and you cannot tell me that the assassination attempt was just luck. It was just pure coincidence that he did not die, because my God shielded Donald Trump. And I don't agree with everything that Donald Trump has done. I think the Epstein files should be released. I think a whole slew of things should be dealt with, but at the end of the day, I do think he's trying to figure out, what does it mean to be president? What does it mean to have a relationship with God? And I hope he leans even more into that. He said, I want to try and get to heaven if possible. I'm hearing I'm not doing well and I'm really at the bottom of the totem pole, but if I can get to heaven, this will be one of the reasons. So 2 things with that. It's a little interesting that he says, I'm hearing I'm not doing well. I don't know if that's related to his health. I don't know what that is related to, but prayers for President Trump. And the second thing is, I believe he has a works-based view of what it means to be a Christian. And I think that he thinks that if he can end this war, that's going to be a big check mark off, and God's going to love him and accept him when he gets into heaven. But the truth is that we are all so sinful and no one can earn their way into heaven. As long as President Trump accepts in his heart that Jesus is Lord and he confesses with his mouth the sins that he has done and he repents for those, he will go to heaven. It is not works-based. We do not have to work our way to heaven. It is purely just accepting that we are nothing without Jesus Christ, and with Jesus Christ we are everything through him. It is not me, but it is Christ in me. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about that because I thought it was interesting. Now let's get the Kremlin's view of what is going down in all of this. So the Kremlin has played down the talk of imminent summit between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky. So basically they're kind of playing down that there would ever be peace or brokering a deal, as Donald Trump renewed his call for the 2 leaders to meet and discuss ending the war in Ukraine. The push for bilateral meetings comes from the U.S. president as he met with Putin in Alaska last week, and upcoming 7 European leaders and Zelensky to the White House on Monday. Trump admitted the conflict was a tough one to solve and conceded that it was possible that the Russian president might not be interested in ending hostiles. We're going to find out about Putin in the next couple of weeks, he said on Tuesday. It's possible he doesn't want to make a deal. And we're seeing this because we're weighing in on, what does Putin want? What does Vladimir Zelensky want? And I think it is interesting that if both presidents truly felt what was best for their country, it would be stopping the fighting. And I think President Putin is definitely not one to back down. He has a serious, he's a serious figure. He's definitely wants the power, wants what I think he thinks is best for his country, even though that can kind of be debatable. But I don't know if he's going to back down from this. That's what I'm saying. I'm going to do a part 2 about this. I'm going to update us on this because this is really important as teens to understand what is going on and what this means. And even if you're not a teen, I'm hoping I'm breaking this down so that you can understand what is actually going on. And on the peace side, it is seeming like Russia and Vladimir Putin are not wanting peace. And that's an interesting fact to note in all of this. So we have Trump meeting with Zelensky. So talks yield real progress on security guarantees, the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer says. So that was kind of interesting because he was there talking about progress being made. So he said, today's meeting was good and constructive. There was a real sense of unity between the European leaders that were there and President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Zelensky, Starmer said, which was the Prime Minister of Britain. And one of the key agreements for this outcome for the 30 countries dubbed the Coalition of the Willing to work on security guarantees for Ukraine and begin coordinating effects in America. So 30 countries are coming together and are dubbed the Coalition of Willing to work on peace guarantees basically for Ukraine and coordination between the US and being able to do that. The second development was an agreement to pursue a bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Trump took a break from his meeting with the European delegate today to phone Putin and purpose the direct meeting with Zelensky and the potential trilateral meeting also involving Trump to later follow, right? So basically the bilateral meeting being that it's just between Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Zelensky, trilateral meaning that it is between President Trump, President Vladimir Zelensky, and President Vladimir Putin, if that is kind of making sense to you guys. But from a lot of European countries, they felt like a lot of process was being made. Again, this was on the Ukrainian side. We're not 100% sure about the Russian side. But here are Putin's demands, and here is him talking about this. So Putin's demands for a ceasefire or a peace deal. Territorial consequences. So Ukraine must withdraw its forces in several different regions and must recognize them as Russian territories, including Crimea. Only then, Putin says, will Moscow cease fire and begin negotiations. That was from The Guardian and several other people. Ukraine must abandon NATO inspirations and disarm. So Kyiv must officially announce its NATO membership ambitions and strong to agree limitations or outright disband of its armed forces, including banned national units and reduce military capacity. So basically wanting them to step down from a lot of their military efforts and want them to be, I would kind of see as weaker, right? Not so much of a threat, even though Ukraine is tiny. And I don't know why maybe Putin would see this as a threat, but definitely the NATO membership ambitions is kind of threatening. The next demand is a ban on mobilization and foreign military aid. So during any supposed ceasefire, Ukraine must stop mobilizing troops, have training, and cease accepted arms, weapons, intelligence, or satellite support from Western allies, basically America. So they have to stop any support that they're getting from any country, mainly America. Secure guarantees and enforcement of mechanisms. So Putin questions how a ceasefire would be enforced and insists it must address root causes, not just freeze the conflict. Russia rejects Western peacekeepers as security guarantees. So we can kind of see that, again, Russia isn't really being very cooperative and they're asking a lot of demands, but at the same point, you're trying to understand from Russia's perspective why this is important for them and this is big for them. And for Trump, it's a very delicate balance of catering to Russia and catering to Ukraine. It's very hard, and I can't even imagine to be in that situation. The next thing they want to do is lift sanctions and guarantee Russian influence. So Ukraine, and by extension, Western powers, must lift sanctions against Russia. Moscow also insists that the Russian language and the rights of Russian-speaking citizens will be upheld in Ukraine. And I think for Putin, it is almost of this way because Ukraine broke off of Russia. I feel like this is his way of kind of trying to take it back to instill, again, Russian language and the Russian history, and maybe he feels like this is his pride of his country being almost taken away by Ukraine. Again, I'm trying to be devil's advocate here, playing to both and trying to be nonpartisan, but here is the last demand that they're making, political and legal concessions. So Kyiv should outlaw nationalist or Nazi organizations, stabilize elections after lifting martial law, and not pursue compensation for damages by Russian invasions. So a lot, right? That's definitely a lot of conditions, but here we go. Why Ukraine being in NATO is such a threat. So let's talk about this. Russia has long called NATO an expansion towards its borders a red line. They do not really like NATO, right? Moscow argues Ukraine and NATO would put Western troops, bases, and possibly nuclear weapons right next to Russia, highlighting tension, right? And if you guys don't know, Russia and America have this sort of tension, if you guys did not know this, because we're teens and we're not going to know everything, but there's always been tension between Russia and America. So Russia kind of felt threatened when Ukraine wanted to go into NATO, which would lead into Western and America kind of having a little bit of more of a input in what Ukraine is doing and being able to put troops on the ground and things like that. So I believe Putin might have felt a little bit pressured. So many believe it would invoke aggression, even a larger war, right? So if Ukraine goes into NATO, a lot of different countries have their own opinions on that and possibly could lead to World War III. NATO's Article 5 problem, right? So NATO members must defend each other if attacked. This pact was formed, and if one of these countries gets attacked, all of these countries that are NATO members will go and support that one country because of all sorts of things. I'm not going to dive into that today, but basically, yeah, if one NATO country gets attacked, all of the other ones go to support that country. If Ukraine joins a still war with Russia, NATO would be legally obligated to fight Russia directly. That means even though this little country of Ukraine, if it got into a war with Russia and if it was part of NATO, that means all of these big countries that have large military would come to fight against Russia, and that is a severe threat against Russia. At risk of a full-scale NATO against Russia war, almost kind of like we saw with Germany and the war. All sorts of different kind of allies and axes were fighting against each other, and not saying that Russia is the modern-day Germany at all. So, but that's basically what would happen is Russia kind of felt threatened that if they went into a war with Ukraine and they were with NATO, all different countries would attack them, if that makes any sense. Not all NATO members agree on bringing Ukraine in, right? This is what I'm saying. So countries like Hungary and Turkey have expressed hesitation. Admitting Ukraine would strain unity, since not every nation wants to fight a war with Russia over Ukrainian territory, which makes 100% sense if you're a different country, let's say France or whatever, and Ukraine and Russia are fighting over land and about history and what language they're speaking. Why do you want to get into a war? Really makes no sense, but here we are. Supporters say NATO protects Ukraine, but critics say it would make the region less stable. Instead of deterring Russia, some argue that it would lock with the West and Moscow into a long-term standoff or force Putin to act more aggressively. This is what I'm saying. One of the reasons, so there's a couple reasons why Russia is attacking Ukraine. Number one, land. Russia wants to gain back the land. Number two, kind of history and language and culture and all those things they want to lock back into Russia. Number three, NATO. They're trying to fight against having America very involved, right? This is the reason why Putin is kind of doing a delicate dance right now between Trump and Zelensky, because he doesn't want America or the West to be involved anywhere near Russia, because he does not want a complete war with NATO. And I can understand that, not that I necessarily support it, but I can understand why he would be concerned that this would be a full-out war. The next one is that Putin and Russian officials claim that Ukraine is historically, culturally, and strategically tied to Russia. This is what I was talking about. They see the NATO membership as Western encroachment, threatening Russian identity and influence. While the West doesn't accept this argument, it's part of Russia's justification for the ongoing war, which, again, it's almost like a war against Western encroachment and for historically accurate things in Russia, and they're wanting to tie back Ukraine to Russia. So if this is making sense to you, then you're going to kind of see I'm going back to some things that will make sense in a little bit. In short, critics of Russia say NATO is risking dragging the West and other countries into a direct war with Russia, fracturing NATO's unity and making peace less likely, and a full-out World War III. This is why, teens, this is why, Gen Z, this is so important to understand. Do your own research. This is all research that I have compiled for you. This is not your school teacher talking about it. This is not CNN talking about it. I am nonpartisan. I want what is best for every human. That being said, I'm not getting everything right here. But the main things we need to worry about is, why is Russia going into this war? Because number one, they feel threatened by the West, by NATO, that they will have an all-out World War III, and Russia does not want that. Number two, Russia feels an entitlement to the Ukrainian land. Since Ukraine used to be Russia, Putin is trying to tie that back into it. Number three, right, they want the culture, they want the history, they want the language back instilled into Ukraine, and they want it all part of Russia without the West involving themselves. And this is why Putin is doing a delicate dance around Trump right now, because he doesn't like the West. There's always been some tension against Russia and America trying to solve what is going to go on. Now, while I'm saying this, I don't agree with what President Putin is doing. I also don't agree with what Vladimir Zelensky is doing either. There is things on either side that I do not agree with. Vladimir Zelensky came into this saying, oh no, Ukraine is dying, Ukraine is we're going through so much, while he was getting the money, he was spending the money, he was taking the money that America was giving them during when Biden was in office, giving them so many dollars. It was going to Vladimir Zelensky's pocket, not Ukraine, not the Ukrainian people suffering, which I think is really interesting. Like I said, I am not leaning for President Putin. I am not going for President Zelensky. I am purely telling you guys the facts and what I have researched on and what I'm reporting on. And so here's a quick breakdown between both presidents. So Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, he's been the president of Ukraine since 2019. The background, this is where things get interesting. Former comedian and actor, most famous for playing the fictional president in the TV show Servants of the People before entering real politics, right? This is kind of interesting. He was playing that he was this political leader in Ukraine, and that actually comes true. Very interesting how all that ties into each other, but we're not going to get into that today. Politics ran on anti-corporation, pro-democracy, and pro-Western platforms. So that was kind of his things that he played on. That was kind of his politics while going into becoming the president. And in the war, he has become the global face of Ukrainian resistance since Russia's invasion in 2022, pushing for Western aid, weapons, and support, which, again, I don't agree with. And people were also asking me, like, well, what does this mean? You know, I thought it's supposed to be America first. What does he mean by helping Ukraine? It's a very delicate balance between helping Ukraine and being America first. And let me tell you all, actually helping Ukraine is going to be putting America first. We do not want Ukraine a part of NATO. Why do we not want Ukraine a part of NATO? Because it's going to probably create a World War III or a massive war that is going to impact a lot of people, millions of people. This is why we don't want complete Western aid, but we also want a little bit of Western aid to be able to create a ceasefire. So this is what I'm saying when Trump is basically dancing with fire and he's being very cautious right now. Vladimir Putin, current role, president of Russia, first took office in 2000 with breaks as prime minister, but has essentially ruled over 2 decades. Background, former KGB officer rose to power after the fall of the Soviet Union. Politics, known for centralization, authoritarian rule, cracking down on dissent, promoting nationalism, and trying to restore Russia's influence as a global power. So this is kind of what he's running on, power, kind of taking back Ukraine, taking back culture, making Russia as big and beautiful as it was before, essentially. And in the war, he launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2002, claiming security concerns, which is true because if Ukraine got into NATO, we've already talked about that. That has already been a full discussion. And he also claiming that historical ties to Ukraine, even though it seems like just a aggressive land grab, which it is a very aggressive land grab, but coming from both sides, Ukraine is its own country already. It doesn't need to be a part of NATO, but it is its own country. It's kind of been its own country for a while. Russia, on one hand, feels like it wants to be part of Ukraine that has culture, that has history, that has language, that they want to bring back into it, and they're concerned about NATO. We're dancing with two sides. I'm nonpartisan. Like I said, we're going to be doing a part 2 about this coming very soon. I think there's a lot of going to be interesting things coming in the next week, but it is important for us as teenagers to know this because, number one, we don't want misinformation. We want to do our own investigation. Don't just take what I'm saying for word. Put this into ChatGPT, put this into Google, and see what is really going on. Look at things like Fox News and CNN and also do your own research. And number 3, I can see the perspective of both countries, but this is very dangerous. And if Ukraine even got close to being in NATO, teens, we are dancing closely, not super closely, but we are dancing closely with World War III, and President Trump is trying to stop it.